The pre-dawn darkness offers no mercy. The wind howls across barren coral islands, carrying with it the stench of death. On Beacon Island, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a woman clutches her children and listens to footsteps approaching through the darkness. She knows what comes next. They call themselves the Council. 28 men with bloodied hands and dead eyes. For 2 months, they have ruled these desolate rocks with terror. The murders began quietly, a throat cut in the night, a drowning disguised as accident. But now, in September 1629, the killing has become sport. More than 100 bodies already lie beneath the coral sand. Men bludgeoned with timber, women strangled, children drowned in tidal pools. And still, the killings continue. How did shipwreck survivors turn into murderers? What drove ordinary merchants and sailors to commit mass slaughter on a godforsaken reef? And why did no one stop them until it was far too late? This is a story of the Batavia, the Dutch East India Company flagship that carried 300 souls toward fortune, and delivered them instead into one of history's most horrific descents into savagery. October 1628, Amsterdam harbor bustles with the machinery of empire. At the heart of it all floats the Batavia, freshest flagship of the Verenigde Stendish Company, the Dutch East India Company. At 160 feet long, she represents the pinnacle of Dutch maritime engineering and commercial ambition. Her holds contain 12 massive treasure chests, each filled with silver coins bound for the spice markets of the East Indies. It is enough wealth to ransom kingdoms. Francisco Pelsart stands on the quarterdeck and watches as the final provisions come aboard. At 34 years old, he serves as the ship's commander, the highest-ranking merchant officer. Pelsart has spent years in the Indies, developing a reputation for ruthless efficiency and fierce loyalty to the company. He knows the route intimately, south along the African coast, past the Cape of Good Hope, then east across the southern Indian Ocean toward Java. The journey typically takes 8 months. With favorable winds and competent leadership, the Batavia should reach Batavia, the company's headquarters in modern-day Jakarta, mid-1629. But Pelsart faces a problem. The ship's skipper, Arian Jacobs, despises him. Jacobs commands the ship's actual sailing operations, the crew, the rigging, the navigation. He is an experienced sailor, but also a drunken braggart who resents taking orders from a merchant. The two men have clashed before on previous 4 years now, trapped together aboard the same ship for 8 months. Their mutual hatred festers. Among the 322 passengers and crew, one man watches the growing tension with particular interest. Geronimus Cornelis serves as the ship's undermerchant, answering to Pelsart in the company hierarchy. At 30 years old, Cornelis cuts an unusual figure for a VOC merchant. Before joining the company, he worked as an apothecary in Haarlem, but his true education came from darker sources. Cornelis studied the forbidden writings of the Anabaptist heretics, radical texts that rejected conventional morality, preached that the elect were above sin, and claimed that paradise could be achieved through suffering and destruction. They didn't know it yet, but Geronimus Cornelis would soon prove himself a true believer. The passenger manifest includes a diverse cross-section of Dutch colonial society. Wealthy merchants travel with their wives and children. Soldiers hired by the company seek their fortune in the East. Craftsmen, laborers, servants all, hoping the Indies will offer opportunities denied them in the crowded cities of Holland. Among them, Lucretia Jans, the elegant wife of a minister already stationed in Batavia, traveling to reunite with her husband. Her presence aboard ship will prove catastrophic in ways no one can yet imagine. The Batavia departs Amsterdam on October 29, 1628, as part of a 7-ship convoy. Initially, the vessels sail together for mutual protection, but as they round the Cape of Good Hope and enter the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean, the ships gradually separate, each racing to be first to market with their cargo. By May 1629, after 6 months at sea, darkness has infected the Batavia's command. Jacobs and Cornelis have become intimate friends, united by their hatred of Pelsart and their growing contempt for company authority. Together, they begin to conceive a terrible plan. Why should they deliver the treasure chests to Batavia? Why enrich the company shareholders sitting comfortably in Amsterdam? The ship carries enough silver to make them all wealthy beyond imagination. All that stands between them and fortune is Pelsart himself and the handful of officers and soldiers who might remain loyal to him. Mutiny. The word passes in whispers between trusted men. But to succeed, they need to provoke Pelsart into actions that will turn the crew against him. They need an incident so outrageous that Pelsart's response will seem tyrannical. and they know exactly how to create such an incident. On the night of May 14th, Lucretia Jones walks the deck after dinner. Without warning, several men emerge from the darkness and attack her. They assault her viciously, then cover her with a mixture of tar and human excrement before disappearing into the night. Lucretia's screams bring people running. Pelsart arrives to find her traumatized and humiliated. He knows immediately this was no random assault. Someone ordered this attack, someone testing his authority, but he cannot prove who. The attackers remain anonymous, and when Pelsart attempts to investigate, Skipper Jacobs refuses to cooperate, claiming the crew will not tolerate excessive discipline. The trap has been sprung. If Pelsart pushes too hard, he risks triggering the very mutiny Canellis and Jacobi's desire. If he does nothing, he appears weak. Pelsart chooses caution. The assault remains unpunished. Beneath the surface, the mutineers grow bolder, recruiting more men to their cause. They begin gathering weapons, making plans, waiting for the right moment. That moment will arrive 3 weeks later, but not in the way anyone expects. Chapter 1. The Wrecking, June 4th, 1629. 4 hours past midnight. The Batavia runs under full sail through darkness and intermittent moonlight. They are somewhere in the eastern Indian Ocean, approaching the western coast of the uncharted southern continent that Portuguese sailors call Terra Australis. Skipper Jacobs should be on deck monitoring their course. Instead, he drinks below with Cornelis, discussing their mutiny plans. The man actually commanding the helm that night is an inexperienced junior officer. He does not see the white foam of breaking waves until it is far too late. The Batavia strikes morning reef at full speed with a sound like the earth splitting open. The impact throws passengers from their hammocks. Timbers splinter. The ship's back breaks across the coral, her hull torn open in a dozen places. Within minutes, seawater floods the lower decks. Panic erupts in the darkness. Passengers scramble upwards through narrow companionways, fighting each other to reach the deck. The ship begins to break apart, waves smashing over her shattered stern. Roughly 40 people drown in those first chaotic moments, strapped below decks or swept overboard into the darkness. As dawn breaks, the survivors survey their situation with growing horror. The Batavia rests impaled on a reef in the middle of empty ocean. Around them, a scatter of low coral islands offers the only refuge. But these islands are barely more than elevated reefs, barren, waterless, exposed to wind and sun. No trees, no soil, no fresh water, just coral rubble and the skeletal remains of seabirds. Pelsart immediately takes command of the evacuation. Using the ship's boats and makeshift rafts, they begin ferrying survivors to the nearest island later, named Beacon Island. 240 people make it safely to land, but their refuge is nightmarish. The island measures perhaps 800 yards long and 300 yards wide. Its surface consists entirely of sharp coral and broken shells. No shade, no fresh water. The sun beats down with murderous intensity. Pelsart makes a desperate decision. From the wreck, he can see larger islands visible on the horizon, perhaps 10 miles distant. Those islands might have water. He orders the ship's longboat prepared. He will take a small crew and search for fresh water. If unsuccessful, he will sail to the Dutch settlement at Batavia, 1,600 miles north, and return with a rescue ship. Before departing, Pelsart makes what will prove a fatal mistake. He places Jeronimus Cornelis in command of the survivors. Cornelis holds the rank of under-merchant, making him senior to most of the remaining men. More importantly, he possesses the keys to the treasure chests, still mostly intact in the Batavia's submerged hull. Pelsart believes Cornelis will protect the company's property until rescue arrives. They didn't know it yet, but Francisco Pelsart has just handed absolute power to a man who views himself as chosen by God to transcend all moral law. Chapter 2. The Division, June 9th. Pelsart's longboat disappears over the northern horizon. Behind him, 240 people crowd onto Beacon Island's waterless coral. Jeronimus Cornelis surveys his new kingdom with satisfaction. His first act is to divide the survivors. He selects 20 of the strongest soldiers, led by a corporal named Weeb Hayes, and orders them to take the ship's boats to the high islands visible on the horizon. Their mission, search for fresh water. Cornelis claims this will benefit everyone. In truth, he simply wants the armed soldiers, the only men who might resist his authority, removed from Beacon Island. Weeb Hayes is approximately 40 years old, a professional soldier who has served the company for years. He accepts Cornelis's orders without question, loads his men into boats, and rows toward the western horizon. He does not realize he is being exiled. Cornelis next separates the survivors into groups. The healthy and useful remain on Beacon Island under his direct control. The sick, the elderly, women with young children, and others he deems expendable are sent to smaller, even more barren coral outcrops. He tells them this is temporary, until better arrangements can be made. In reality, he is already planning their deaths. Among those who remain on Beacon Island, Lucretia Jans, the minister's wife, assaulted before the wreck. Cornelis has been obsessed with her since that night. Now, with Pelsart gone, nothing constrains him. Days pass, then weeks. The situation on Beacon Island deteriorates rapidly. With no fresh water, survivors lick dew from rocks each morning and pray for rain. A few barrels of wine salvaged from the wreck provide brief relief but soon run out. Men begin drinking seawater, which hastens their deaths. Bodies accumulate beneath the coral. Cornelis makes lists of who lives and who dies. He begins gathering trusted followers, men desperate enough or immoral enough to follow him into darkness. Chapter 3. The Council of Death. By late June, Cornelis has assembled his core group. They call themselves the Council. 28 men, bound together by oath and shared crime. Cornelis explains his vision. Pelsart will never return. The company has abandoned them. Survival requires difficult choices. They must reduce the number of mouths to feed, and they must eliminate anyone who might challenge their authority when rescue eventually arrives. The first murders are disguised as accidents. Men sent to dive the wreck for salvage simply never resurface. No witnesses, no questions, a quick droning beneath the waves. Then, the killing becomes more systematic. Cornelis sends small groups of his expendable survivors to the outer islands, supposedly to search for food. Once there, the council members traveling with them produce knives and clubs. The screaming doesn't last long. Bodies are weighted with stones and dropped into deep water, or simply left on remote reefs for the gulls. But the worst was yet to come. On the outer islands, where Cornelis had sent the sick and weak, survivors are dying of thirst and starvation. Some attempt to swim back to Beacon Island to beg for water. Cornelis orders them clubbed to death as they crawl ashore. The killings are now happening in daylight, in front of witnesses. Anyone who protests becomes the next victim. Cornelis establishes rules for his new society. He alone possesses ultimate authority. His word is law. He takes the best salvaged food, the best shelter, the finest clothes recovered from the wreck, and he claims Lucretia Jans as his concubine. When she refuses him, he has 2 of his council members force her into his tent. She will remain his captive for the next 2 months, enduring repeated assaults while surrounded by men too terrified to intervene. By July, the scale of killing has become industrial. Cornelis no longer bothers with pretense. Families are murdered together, father, mother, children. Teenage boys have their throats cut as they sleep. Men are forced to dig their own graves before being clubbed from behind. The council develops preferred methods: drowning for the adults, strangulation for children, bashing infants against rocks. The coral becomes stained with blood that the tide cannot wash away. Chapter 4. The holdouts unknown to Cornelis. Not all survivors have bent to his will. On the high islands later named West Wallaby Island and East Wallaby Island, Webb Hayes and his 20 soldiers have made a remarkable discovery. Fresh water seeping through the limestone beneath certain areas of the larger island, enough to sustain life indefinitely. They also find wallaby small marsupials that can be hunted for meat. Against all odds, Hayes' group is not merely surviving but thriving. Hayes is no fool. He understands immediately why Cornelis sent them away. When several weeks pass with no boat arriving from Beacon Island, Hayes realizes something has gone terribly wrong. He sets men to watch the horizon constantly. He posts sentries at night, and he begins fashioning weapons from salvaged materials. Spears tipped with nails, clubs weighted with stones, shields constructed from timber planks. Back on Beacon Island, Cornelis grows increasingly paranoid. The soldiers on the high islands represent a threat to his absolute control. What if they return? What if they resist? What if they side with survivors against the council? He must eliminate them before rescue arrives. Cornelis sends a small boat to the high islands carrying several council members. Their instructions: assess Hayes' defenses, gain his trust, then murder him and his men in their sleep. But Hayes is ready. When the boat approaches, his men stand armed on the beach, and the council members realize immediately they are outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They retreat to Beacon Island with troubling news. The soldiers are alive, organized, and ready to fight. Chapter 5. The War, August 1629. For 2 months, Cornelis has ruled through terror. At least 125 people are dead, perhaps more. The exact number will never be known with certainty. As many bodies were destroyed or thrown into the sea. The survivors who remain alive on Beacon Island exist in constant terror, never knowing if they will see another dawn. But now Cornelis faces a strategic problem. He controls most of the salvaged weapons from the wreck: muskets, swords, pikes. He commands more men than Hayes. Yet Hayes occupies defensible territory with fresh water and food supplies. A direct assault across open water against a fortified position would be costly and might fail. Worse, it might expose Cornelis's weaknesses. Men are bullies and murderers, but not trained soldiers. Hayes commands actual fighters with military discipline. Cornelis attempts negotiation. He sends messages claiming he wants peace, cooperation, sharing of resources. Hayes responds with contempt. He knows what happened on Beacon Island. Survivors have escaped Cornelis's control by swimming to the high islands under cover of darkness, bringing horrific stories of mass murder. Hayes has even seen bodies washing ashore on his beaches, men, women, and children bearing the marks of violent death. The two camps enter a state of Cold War. Cornelis cannot eliminate Hayes without risking his own position. Hayes cannot rescue the survivors on Beacon Island without boats. So they watch each other across 10 miles of open water and wait. Then everything changes. Chapter 6. Rescue and Reckoning. September 15th, 1629. 3 months after departing Beacon Island, Francisco Pelsart returns. His journey to Batavia was an epic of survival. 33 days in an open boat, navigating 1,600 miles through waters where no European ship had yet charted a safe course. Every man aboard survived to reach port within days of arriving. Pelsart commandeered a rescue ship, the Sardom, loaded it with water and provisions, and began the return voyage. Now, as the Sardom approaches the Abrajos Islands, Pelsart expects to find grateful survivors maintaining discipline while awaiting rescue. Instead, he finds hell. The first boat to reach the Sardom carries Weeb Hayes and several of his soldiers, who row out frantically as soon as they spot sails. Hayes boards and delivers his report with military precision. Mutiny, mass murder, more than 100 dead. Cornelis and his council currently control Beacon Island, the wreck site, and most of the salvaged treasure. They are armed and dangerous, and they will fight to avoid capture. Pelsart cannot believe what he hears. Yet the evidence surrounds him: emaciated survivors, mass graves visible on the smaller islands, and Hayes' own armed camp, clearly built for defense against fellow castaways, not external threats. Pelsart acts with decisive fury. He arms Hayes and his soldiers with muskets from the Sardom's arsenal. Together, they sail directly to Beacon Island. The landing is opposed by Cornelis's men, but briefly, when they realize they face trained soldiers with superior weapons, backed by company authority, most of the council members throw down their arms. Only the most fanatical fight. They are quickly overwhelmed. Garanimus Cornelis is found hiding in his tent, cowering behind Lucretia Jans. He is dragged into the sunlight and shackled. Over the following days, Pelsart conducts rapid trials. The surviving witnesses, some who participated in the council under duress, others who watched in terror from the sidelines, provide testimony. The scale of atrocity emerges with brutal clarity. The executions begin immediately. Pelsart cannot afford to wait. There is no prison ship to hold 70+ murderers for the months-long voyage to Batavia. Justice must be swift, and company law provides ample precedent. Mutiny and murder carry mandatory death sentences. The first to die are the lower-ranking council members, the men who wielded the clubs and knives but claimed to be following orders. They are hanged from the Sardom's yardarm, their bodies left dangling as warning and spectacle. Pelsart orders each execution conducted in full view of the remaining prisoners. This is theater as much as justice, demonstrating that company authority has been restored and will be absolutely enforced. But for the ringleaders, Pelsart reserves special punishment. Dutch legal tradition holds that the most heinous crimes deserved the most painful deaths. Geronimus Cornelis, as architect of the entire massacre, will suffer appropriately. On October 2nd, 1629, Cornelis is brought to a small island later named Seal Island. He is forced to kneel. Company soldiers systematically cut off both his hands using an axe. The stumps are cauterized with boiling pitch to prevent immediate death from blood loss. Then the real punishment begins. Cornelis is hoisted onto a gallows constructed specifically for this purpose. But he is not simply hanged. Instead, he is strangled slowly with a garrote-thin rope tightened gradually around the throat. The process takes more than an hour. Witnesses later testify that Cornelis screamed for mercy until his voice failed, then merely gurgled until consciousness finally fled. His body is left hanging from the gallows as carrion for the seabirds he once ruled over. 6 other ringleaders receive similar treatment, hands amputated, then death by strangulation. Their bodies are displayed prominently on various islands throughout the Abrahos chain. Pelsard wants to ensure that any ship passing this way in the future will understand what happens to those who betray the company. Not all council members face death. A few who participated under clear duress, or who provided testimony against their fellows, receive reduced sentences. 2 men considered too young to fully understand the gravity of their crimes, but too guilty to escape punishment entirely are sentenced to maroning. They are left on the Australian mainland with minimal provisions. It is effectively a death sentence of slower variety, though Pelsart records it as mercy. The surviving innocent castaways number 70. They are emaciated, traumatized, some bearing permanent scars from the council's tortures. Lucretia Jans, perhaps the most visible victim, testifies at the trials, but afterward maintains strict silence about her months of captivity. She will eventually reunite with her husband in Batavia, but historical records suggest she never fully recovered from the ordeal. Weeb Hayes becomes the unlikely hero of the disaster. His military discipline, his refusal to submit to Cornelis's authority, and his defense of the High Islands prevented an even greater catastrophe. Without Hayes's resistance, Cornelis would have murdered every last survivor before Pelsart returned. The company recognizes Hayes's valor, promoting him and granting him a substantial financial reward. He is one of the few men to emerge from the Batavia disaster with enhanced reputation. Arian Jacobes, the skipper whose drunken negligence caused the initial wreck, faces his own trial. Though not directly involved in the massacre, he was aboard Pelsart's longboat during the entire crisis. His role in planning the original mutiny and his complicity in Lucretia Jan's assault seal his fate. He is convicted of multiple crimes and executed in Batavia, though less spectacularly than Cornelis. Francisco Pelsart recovers most of the company's treasure from the wreck. The silver chests, miraculously, remained largely intact in the submerged hull. He delivers them safely to Batavia, along with a detailed journal documenting the entire catastrophe. But the affair has broken him. The stress of command, the horror of discovering the massacre, the weight of ordering mass executions all take their toll. Pelsart participates in one final expedition to Sumatra, then dies in Batavia in September 1630. Barely a year after the massacre, he was 35 years old. The Batavia herself remains on Morning Reef, slowly disintegrating in the tropical water. Over the following centuries, storms and tides scatter her timbers across the seabed. The Abrahos Islands become infamous among sailors, a place cursed by the ghosts of murdered innocents. For more than 300 years, the wreck site lies undisturbed except by fish and coral. In 1963, Australian fishermen discover scattered wreckage and artifacts near Beacon Island. Archaeological investigation confirms the site as the Batavia. Over subsequent decades, researchers recover thousands of artifacts, silver coins, navigational instruments, cannons, even personal items belonging to individual passengers. In the 1970s, human remains are discovered in mass graves on Beacon Island, victims of Cornelis's massacre, their bones bearing evidence of violent trauma consistent with historical accounts. The most haunting discovery comes in 2017, when archaeologists uncover another mass grave containing 5 individuals buried with evidence of both Care and Hasperhab's victims, whose bodies were hidden by survivors who still retained some shred of humanity amid the carnage. Today, the Batavia Shipwreck is a protected heritage site. The largest surviving section of the hull rests in the Shipwreck Museum in Fremantle, Western Australia. Visitors can stand before the massive timbers and imagine the 300 souls who departed Amsterdam expecting fortune, only to find horror on a desolate coral reef. On West Wallaby Island, the stone fort built by Weeb Hayes and his soldiers still stands, the oldest surviving European structure in Australia. It serves as monument not to conquest or exploration, but to the simple human instinct for survival and resistance against tyranny. The Batavia disaster forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. How quickly does civilization collapse when authority fails? What transforms ordinary men into murderers? And perhaps most troubling, would we recognize the Gieronymus Cornelis types among us before they gain power? Or do such men reveal themselves only when restraint disappears? The windswept islands of the Abrahos keep their secrets. But beneath the coral and the tides, the bones remain silent witnesses to one of history's most horrific transformations of shipwreck into massacre, of disaster into deliberate evil, of survival into slaughter. More than 100 innocent people died on those barren reefs, not because the sea took them, but because other humans chose murder when society's bonds dissolved. That is the true horror of the Batavia, not the shipwreck itself, but what came after. If you found this story compelling, there are many more forgotten tales of survival and tragedy waiting to be told. The sea keeps its secrets, but history remembers those who refuse to let them remain buried.